and welcome to Identerati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, and this week we're talking about, can big tech solve the identity crisis? And our guest is Jeff Schwartz. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Mike.
And Rizelle Scarlett. Welcome, Rizelle.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Good to see you, Rizelle.
Good to see you too.
So, Jeff is the founder and the CEO of a company called Dentity, which I'm probably oversimplifying, but works in providing a way for people to identity proof themselves and share their identity with their peers. And Rizelle is a developer advocate at TBD. Maybe before we jump in, Rizelle, you could just tell us a little bit about what that entails and what you do.
Yeah, sure, totally. So just for people to know, TBD is like a business unit within Block, and Block owns like Cash App and Tidal and all these other companies. But TBD is one of our newest units, and we're basically working on solving like digital identity. We created this thing called Web5, and we're just trying to make it easier for people to be able to own their data and their identity and be able to take it with them. And as a developer advocate, I'm kind of like the conduit between like developers and the business. So making sure that they understand how to use our SDKs, whether that's through like writing blog posts or talking on live streams or going to conferences. That's it.
Yeah, so I saw actually Rizelle and Whale, one of her colleagues, did a really interesting live stream with Jeff. I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks back, and I linked that in the show wiki, so everyone can watch that. So I don't want to go over all that content. People should watch that, but maybe I'll just start and we'll review a little bit of what's there. So Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about what's the actual business problem that Dentity solves?
Well, I know you have an enterprise-heavy audience, so I'll sort of approach it from that perspective. Let's start sort of from the beginning, right? When the internet was born, it was born without identity. Okay, and that's created a number of problems that are specific to the problems that we're solving. First, there is no identity, so every internet service, every website has had to create their own identity level. And what that essentially means is that it's why you have 350 passwords, or Mike, you probably have 550 or 1,000, I don't know, right? So all of that data gets stored up into a central database, right? And the business enterprise has to create its own identity layer with its customers or its stakeholders. Now, the problem with that is that all that data gets stored centrally, right? And what happens to centralized data storage? We know that ultimately it gets ruined, and that's why we have billions of identities for sale. So, for the enterprise, one of the key things that we solve is this sort of new identity layer, which is owned by the consumer, right? It's owned by the consumer, and they bring their identity to the enterprise rather than the enterprise bringing its identity to the consumer. So in a nutshell, that's sort of the problem we solve for the enterprise. Now, for the consumer, the big problem we solve is that they've historically never had access to, they've never had a person, they've never been able to have that relationship with their data, right? They've always given it to another, an enterprise, and they've never been able to use it. So when I go and I, give my information, if I'm getting, let's just use the government, for example, right? So I go and I give them all of my information. I log in with my license and my ID. They store that in a central database, and I can't use it. It's useless to me. So the problem that we're working on is the same problem that Rizelle's focused on, which is, the consumer has to have a relationship with their personal data. They have to be able to use it, in a privacy respecting way. And those are the things that we're focused on, in terms of the enterprise and the consumer problem.
I love the question, but I'll let you go, Mike.
No, Rizelle, please. Yeah.
Okay, my question. Sorry, so I hope I'm not derailing anything. But
Rizelle, you can't smile or laugh when you ask questions. You have to be serious.
I'll be serious. I literally talk with a smile. But so my question, like, I was just thinking, like, you described what Dentity does, and I've been like looking at the title, like, big tech can't solve identity.
Right.
or the identity crisis. And I'm like, from your perspective, who can though? Because like I kind of consider, even though TBD is like a startup, it's still within like an enterprise company
Right.
called Block. So I'm curious from your perspective, is it open
Well,
source, government?
let me first say that I don't. Enterprise is a big tech company, obviously, but it's taking a different approach with TBD, and I think you guys have correctly realized that there's power in giving consumers creating a relationship with between consumers and their data. Let me go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution really quickly, okay? So the Industrial Revolution, Mike, you'll laugh here. I'm going to be very quick. The Industrial Revolution was first about giving machines to companies, right? But it didn't take off until you gave machines to people, right? Cars, home automation, things like that. Now we're sort of in another industrial revolution. For the last 20 years, big tech has had the data machine, right? They've had the big data, they've had CRM, they've all these tools with our data. This new revolution is about giving the data machine to consumers, right? This next level of digital, digital wow isn't going to take off until we give this data machine to consumers and let them solve it for themselves. Now, there's a million other reasons why that big tech can't solve it, but just historically, you've got to give this technology to consumers, and identity tech is one of them. One of the tools you have to give to consumers.
One thing that I thought you did a good job of explaining in the previous live stream was the idea of counterparty risk.
Yeah.
And how that is particularly important in the gig economy. Can you talk a little bit more about what does that mean, counterparty risk?
Right. So let's put some context into the gig economy and why it's important today. Right. So 75 million people in the U.S. are involved in the gig economy in one way. They're contractors, they're gig workers, they're using it. So over half of all employees in the U.S. today are independent or contractors, which is incredible number, right, Mike? Because we're old enough to remember that when you graduated college, everybody said you had to go work for a big company, right? It's a little bit different now. So the gig economy is all around us. It's how we use transportation, it's how we use groceries, everything like this, order groceries. So the gig economy fundamentally is about trust, right? It's about counterparty trust, which is you have to have some understanding of who the other person is on the other side of the internet, right? So the key to trust in this digital economy is identity, right? Without identity, you have no understanding of who you're taking counterparty risk with. So think about Facebook Marketplace. Think about Craigslist. Think about getting in a car with somebody you don't know. Think about inviting somebody over to your home to walk their dog. You have to have some base level understanding of who they are. The thing, Mike, is you can't trust these platforms that we all use to verify their users. They won't do it. They're not motivated by it. It's not part of their business model, right? I mean, they will not do it. And we can go through the data. 35% of all listings in Facebook Marketplace are scams, right? They're there to just scam people. About the same number. I mean, this is according to the FTC data. The same percentage of people on dating apps. 30% of all dating app profiles are specifically there to scam people. And you can look at Match Group. They say, well, we get rid of 95% of spam listings. Well, that other 5% represents 30% of their listings of their profiles. So consumers cannot trust the big tech companies and their platforms to verify their users. They can't even trust them to verify if their users are human. They can't, right? So consumers have to be empowered on their own to be able to do this. And if we don't give them the tools to do this, they're left to sort of twist in the wind. It's a dangerous environment out there.
Rizal, what do you think? Have you, as a millennial, do you see, who's probably an active, gig, you probably grew up, using Uber and all of these like gig sharing apps. What is your thought about, do you see this counterparty risk? Is that real?
I think so. You know what's interesting? I just came off of watching a TBD live stream where these people made like a Web5 like ride sharing app. So like they were saying, like as an alternative to like Uber or Lyft, this is a better way for users to be able to share their specific data, be able to have ownership. I know you have like a follow-up question about Airbnb, so I think this leads into it. But like there's better, they've implemented a way where there's like better like security around like who they're jumping in the car with and stuff like that. So I do agree with Jeff on this topic.
Yeah, a lot of
Can I make one point here really quickly? You know,
Please.
part of what we're trying to solve here is, I'll call it the gray matter. There are, think about all the transactions that don't take place for people that have just opted out of the market because they can't trust platforms. So whether it's all the cars that don't get sold online because people don't want to participate in the peer-to-peer auto sales market, all the people that don't list their their profile on dating apps because they don't want to fight through the scams. So there's this, I'll call it, this sort of gray matter of things that never get done in the gig economy, in the trust economy, in the digital economy, because people are concerned about the risk. So I think once you start to solve this issue of reducing counterparty risk on the internet, then there's an entirely new revolution of activity that happens when people just opt out right now.
So the opportunity cost, you could say,
Yeah.
of what we're doing now and what we're not able to do if we only
Yeah.
had better technologies. I guess I'm still, it seems like, well, you're right, for some of these low value transactions like marketplace, the counterparty risk, there's a lot of scams in the dating site. And I actually want to talk about this more because you mentioned previously the AARP implementation you're working on.
Yeah.
Actually, I think Uber hasn't been that bad. I feel like it's the Uber drivers are probably more at risk from picking up
Yeah.
random passengers than
Yeah.
the other way around.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be a certain amount of like crime and like bad actors and people out there who are going to find ways to break the system.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Airbnb does an okay job, I guess.
Yeah.
My company hires on Upwork, and they
Yep.
do a first level of identity proofing, although not to the level that we want. So we do additional identity proofing on top of there, but at least it's a filter for us.
Right.
So, so I guess where do you think are the biggest problem areas for high value transactions?
Well, I don't really know what you mean high value. The number of transactions that take place on marketplace, for example, some of them are drop shipped, some of them are porch pickup, right? And so we have an agreement with the largest Facebook marketplace sellers group. I think there's 25,000 sellers in the group, and we're just getting started. We've only had it for a couple months, but it's really fascinating. Because of the fraud in that marketplace, Mike, we probably only verified a couple hundred sellers there now. But the sellers that we're working with right now, when they badge themselves as being verified, right? We have these badges. They watermark their profile image and they watermark their photos. You know what's happening, Mike? They're getting 3 times the lift and half the spam. So their listings are getting 3x the views, and they're getting half the number of inbound inquiries. So that translates into a 6x sales efficiency bump, right? So just by verifying that you're a real human, a real person that's been verified. So whether they're selling a PlayStation or a car, it doesn't much matter. Just verifying that you're a real human, that your data has been verified, is translating into a huge lift over there in that marketplace.
Well, let's pivot to the AARP question because, we're not going to do a demo of your technology. Actually, you do a really nice demo in the live stream that Rizal and Whale did previously on TBD. And it was a very cool demo, and it made it very clear what your product does.
Yeah.
But one of the things I noticed is that in the flow, it was sort of kicked off by scanning a QR code.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to a Microsoft engineer who told me that like more than 50% of users drop off when presented with a QR code.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about retired people who
Yeah.
are older.
Yeah.
And then even on the Pew article you mentioned, I think only 37% of them in 2016 were on social media. I don't know if that number's gone up or down since then.
Mhm.
But what's your experience been sort of looking at the usability of? So you've developed this solution, but how is it actually? What's the reception and can you actually get your grandparents or your parents in
Yeah.
my case?
Yeah.
to use
Well,
this
and
stuff?
Rizel's got, I mean, Rizel will jump in here as well, but that's why we're focused on reusable identity, right? So the very first time you do this, when somebody has to present their passport or their license, there's a drop off. That's going to happen, right? But the next time they do it, remember, you do it once, Mike, and you never have to do it again, right? So the first commitment of time is typically about 2 minutes. So if we can get 2 minutes of your time, right, to pull your license out, we can scan 16,000 different documents front and back. We do, presentation of the live video selfie. That takes about 2 minutes, and then you never have to do it again, right? The next time you do it, Mike, it takes about, I don't know, 10 seconds. So it's very fast. So our experience thus far, whether it's, I'll give you a good proxy, which is the National Notary Association. So we do all the identity verification for the NNA. So, pretty soon here, 100% of notaries in the US that are doing a home mortgage will have gone through our identity verification system, and they have to do it every year. So we have, 85-year-olds literally going through that process, and we don't have any issues with them at all. So it's a very easy process. It's pretty intuitive. Now there's obviously friction, right? I'm not saying there is no friction, but there's no way that we can get to this world where everybody has a digital ID and everybody is reusing a digital ID. We just have to get through that friction, and ultimately everybody will have a reusable ID. Don't you agree, Rizel?
Yeah, I think yes, that's like TBD's goal right now is to create an ease of use. I don't know if you all have ever used like the application Blue Sky, the social media platform. Behind the scenes, there is like a decentralized identifier happening, and people don't even know it. So like that's really the entire goal or like user experience that we want to be able to implement in like this SSI spaces where it's like you don't even know that this is what's happening in the background for you. But I did have a follow-up question because people keep asking me this, and I'm curious on like Jeff's perspective on this. I know like my perspective, but a lot of people ask me like in addition to it leaving behind like older people, they're concerned that this will like this digital identity revolution will leave behind people in like developing countries or people from different socioeconomic backgrounds who maybe not have like all these different like digital devices. So I'm curious from your perspective, do you think that will happen, or how do we like make it accessible and inclusive for them too?
Yeah, look, it's a concern, right? But that's why you have, like a lot of countries are doing national digital IDs.
Yeah.
And that's just, in some of these countries where there are people that don't have access to a physical document, even in the US, I think it's 15 or 16% of people don't have a driver's license or a passport. So it's a real concern. And it's a concern that I think ultimately digital identity, we haven't addressed it. Identity has not addressed it yet because we're still, we'll have a couple million identities this year, but that's still the very, just the very, very top of the, scratching the surface, right? But it's an issue, Rizel, and it's one that we're going to have to resolve. And particularly in Southeast Asia and countries like in Africa and whatnot, it's going to take a national effort to resolve that issue because we can't do our job unless we have a document. And so we have to start our work from a document. That's just where we are in terms of the market.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think that's why TBD is starting with like Africa and Brazil first.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, so yeah, that driver's license or passport or ID card that you scan is part of the foundational identity infrastructure of the country and how they roll that out.
Right.
I'm actually there's a live stream coming up in a couple of weeks with Ironworks about a verifiable credentials rollout that they did in Bhutan.
Mm-hmm.
as for foundational identity.
That's great.
And so, yeah, I think, well, it's Bhutan, of course, is a small country, so it's like a laboratory for a larger, how a larger government might do it. You can't. There's only so many conclusions you can, draw from a couple 100,000 people. But
I'll tell you what's not going to happen, and Rizal will jump in here as well. We're not going to get everybody verified through Facebook or through Twitter or through one of these, centralized companies. It's just not going to happen. Consumers have lost trust in big tech, and particularly the social media platforms. They will not give more information to these companies. They just will not. So, the way we think about it is that, it can't be one to end, right? It can't be one company like Facebook verifying everybody. It has to be end to end. It has to be truly peer to peer. Every peer is both a verifier and a relying party, and that's the way this is going to spread out, right? So it's not going to spread out by everybody paying $14.99 to Meta every month to have their identity a blue check mark. I'll tell you, that's I'm pretty sure about that. So we've got to create a model, right, where everybody can own it, and then they can trade it and use it with other people in their network.
Yeah.
The article that you mentioned in the homework, the Pew Research, which talked about Americans, I guess, lack of trust in the social media platforms.
Right.
But the most trusted platform was actually the cell phone manufacturers, i.e.
Really?
Apple.
Yeah.
And so the way that I read that research was people trust Apple more than they trust the federal government or Facebook. And what we're seeing also with the rollout of passkeys is that Apple, Google, and Microsoft are going to control access, just like they are increasingly having your passwords. They're also going to have your passkeys, which will control access to your site. So my contention is that people actually do trust big tech. In fact, that's the only thing they trust right now. But I would just differentiate between big tech. Like, are you throwing Microsoft, Google, and Apple into big tech?
Well, at times, right? So people distrust. People don't want to give all their more identity information to Google, right? Google already has enough information about us. And remember, like, if you think about sort of the access management, what's happened over 50 years, right? In the beginning, it was every organization had to create their own identity layer, right? That's why you have 350 passwords. Then federated identity came about. Then instead of me having to give all my information to Airbnb basically uses Google as my identity provider, right? So I log into Airbnb with Google. Right, so it goes from one to one to one to n, and then the next revolution is end to end, which is everybody owning their identity, right, and being able to log in anywhere. So whether they trust Google or Apple is not really the issue. The revolution that's happening is about consumer ownership, about more consumer control, right? And so that to me is the zeitgeist that you can't uncork it, right? People want more control. They want more control. They want more privacy. And so I think, it's very much like, like I said about the Industrial Revolution, giving the data machine to consumers is going to uncork all this economic activity that we can't even imagine. And that's what, like, Rizal's working on. It's what we're working on.
Well, Rizal, do you agree? Do you agree that, I guess, do people want more control? Sure. But do you agree that actually that they want more control more than they want the ease of use from going to the Apple store and getting their device restored?
I think that convenience plays the largest factor when like users are using anything. Sometimes they would trade their privacy for that, but I think that's because we don't know that there's like another option or like opportunity. And I do see that people don't trust certain parts of big tech, especially as like AI is really ramped up. Like when I worked at GitHub, that was like a top thing I was focused on, and there was a lot of people coming to me like, is GitHub stealing my code and things from me? So I do think there's a little bit of a concern, but because there's this use or convenience, they don't know that they can do another option, so they just go for the easiest way.
You know, what I would say,
Um,
Mike, is, consumers didn't know they had a taxi cab problem until Uber told you had a taxi cab problem, right? Um, consumers didn't know there was an accommodations issue until Airbnb came around. So new models uncork all this economic activity, all this opportunity that consumers just don't know about. So what we're trying to do, consumers don't know the value of owning their own data and being able to control it in a way that they've never been able to control it. So once we start to give consumers access to this data, right, they're going to start to make different decisions. Today, everybody says they care about privacy, but everybody will trade their data for a slice of pizza. That's just the reality, right? But as they get more control over their data, they're going to understand that their data is worth something. And let me give you an example. I'm not going to tell you the name of the specific company here, but there is one company that is unlocking a program where you can pay down your debt with personal data. I'm going to say that again. You can pay down your debt using personal data, right? By exchanging more personal data, because this platform, and it's a huge platform, recognizes that personal data is of value and that the consumer owns it. So those are two things that will happen over time where consumers understand that their data is worth something and they're not going to just give it away and trade it for nothing.
So you say this revolution is happening, that people are moving to decentralized identity to take control of their data, but I'm really not convinced. When I look out there, I see a company like ID.me that looks pretty similar to the value prop for identity. From the business perspective, businesses as relying parties are saying, I can consume this verified data and I'll pay for that. And I see identity as having a somewhat similar value prop. And as you said yourself, who cares about the technology? The consumer doesn't know whether it's a DID or a database. So my question is does the evidence really show that people want this decentralized infrastructure? Because ID.me is doing hundreds of millions of sales and is about to go public. And Dentity, I don't think, is about to go public. So maybe the data is actually telling you that people don't care and they want this value prop, but they really don't care about the control or the decentralization.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good counterpoint, but I would just make the following points. First, ID.me has, dozens of government contractors, and so they're collecting the data for the government. Let's be honest, right? So, you don't own the data that you give ID.me. You don't, right? You don't have your own self-sovereign, identity wallet. You can't take your ID.me identity with you. Best I understand, ID.me didn't come to Rizal to TBD and say, hey, we want to build, a self-sovereign, Web5 identity company. They've been storing data, that the government, through government contracts, in a central database, right? So I've had to access ID.me. I don't have an ID.me, DID or wallet anywhere. I can't reuse my ID.me identity anywhere. I mean, it's they own it. It's centrally controlled. So using ID.me as a proxy for Web5 self-sovereign identity isn't a fallacious comparison, right? Because I don't have any relationship with my data. It's ID.me's data and the government's data. So what ID.me proves is the centralized enterprise model is a good business, right? There's 20 software companies and there's a $15 billion business there or whatever. So we didn't start Dentity to innovate enterprise KYC. That's not why we're here. We're here to create a new category, which is about the consumer's relationship with their data. And until we can get enough traction and scale, and get the same number of identities that ID.me has, it's not a good comparison, really. But I do agree that ID.me, ID.me is a good example of an enterprise software company using a centralized database with huge enterprise government contracts. That's a good business, and that's their business, but it's certainly not ours.
Rizal, yeah, from your perspective, do you see that also? Do people care, and does this decentralized identity? I don't know that it presents the value prop that Jeff is saying.
I kind of think it does. Okay, so yeah, the stats are not there yet. I think this is a much newer space, and Yeah, like there's not like all these governments backing it. But when I talk to people about like the use case of verifiable credentials and stuff like that, I could definitely see like their faces light up. This is more like anecdotal than like, oh, I have like all the stats here. But people get really excited about the fact that like, oh, I can use a verifiable credential possibly, or like whatever reusable identity I have, and not have to reveal like my whole address and my name and everything at like if I'm going into like a bar. I just want to prove that I'm over 21. Every time I like give that as an example, people are like, dang, I wish I had that. Or even we have this other product or this other company partnering with us and building their tools with Web5, and they're basically called Form Free. And basically what they're doing is allowing people to get the power back when they're trying to get a loan. So instead of it revealing stuff like, oh, this person lives on this street, or maybe that they're of this race, and making them more susceptible to unconscious bias, it just reveals like some necessary information, maybe their credit score, and they match up with another with a bank, or they have banks give them offers and they say, okay, I want this one. And whenever I tell people those type of examples, they get very excited. So I think there is a value prop. We're just like in a newer stage, and we have to wait for people to or continue to give these examples and use cases for people to catch up.
I think I'm going to jump in here. Rizel's exactly right. The reason consumers will trade their data for a slice of pizza is because that's what they put the value of it. The value of their data, because big tech has obfuscated the value of your personal data, right? Because they just collect it and it's all for free. And the consumers don't really get that fact that like, hey, listen, these big tech companies are making billions of dollars on our data. It's worth something, right? Our data is worth something. And once we start to, change that sort of perspective with consumers in their mind that their data is of value, they're going to want to own it and control it and be able to monetize it themselves, right? But today in their mind, it's worth a slice of pizza because big tech has told them it's worth a slice of pizza, which is nothing, right? But that's changing, and it will change more over time.
So I'm with you on the counterparty trust issue. I think, for example, the dating site example that you give is really an important one, and it's resulting in billions of dollars of fraud with all the scams. And you mentioned the AARP is very concerned about its members being scammed in dating fraud. So I do agree that counterparty risk is a huge issue, and democratizing that is potentially would be great, right? Like not only enterprises should be able to make sure you're real, but give that power to other people. So I'm with you on that. I just wonder if the technology. I don't understand why the wallet needs to be involved as an enabler for this type of system. Selective disclosure, which people want. So for me to not disclose my birthday, but still give my age, for example, that doesn't really rely on a wallet presentation or a verifiable presentation. There are other ways we can do that from the server side. It sounds like you have some deep distrust of basically any honeypot of data sitting on the server side.
Yeah, I do.
However, those honeypots aren't going anywhere. The only thing that's getting removed from those honeypots is the credentials.
What data can you present? What data can you present and tell us that the honeypot of central data is anything other than a risk? I mean, all the data that I've seen over the last 10 years in particular tells me that where there's a honeypot of centralized data, right, it's ultimately going to get hacked, and it's going to be available to bad actors online.
Yeah, and the track record of industry and government has been pretty abysmal here. No one's safe. Healthcare systems, our government personnel records of all our Army and CIA people, it doesn't get any worse. And the repercussions for companies getting breached seem to be pretty mild. So there doesn't seem to be a huge incentive. However, the point that I'm making is that if I do a verifiable presentation of my data to a website, they're still going to take that data and store it in their database when they fulfill the order. So it's not like my identity data isn't being sprinkled all over the internet. The only thing that's not being sprinkled as liberally are the passwords, because luckily at least I can store my credentials in fewer places.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering, is this the identity crisis that you were thinking about in the title of our show, Big Tech Can't Solve Identity Crisis?
Mhm.
Is the identity crisis centralization of data? And does verifiable credentials actually present a solution to that problem?
Mhm. No, the identity crisis that I'm thinking of is the crisis that's happening really with the consumer, right? The consumer, has no ability to create counterparty trust in an economy that's based on counterparty trust. That's really what we're focused on. Identity and access management, is part of the story. It's an outcome of the consumer holding their data, but we didn't start identity to create another identity access management product for enterprise. Really, it can be used that way, but the real issue that we're trying to solve, Mike, is this issue of counterparty trust among peers on the internet, right? And unlocking all the economic activity that's going to take place when consumers can use the internet and trust each other.
Rizal, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second and just ask, um, what's your perspective on the breaches and the security of your data? It seems like Americans are just sort of like resigned to the fact that their data will be hacked in a million different places, and there's nothing. Are you as cynical as I am in this area?
um, I guess before joining TBD, I was like, wow, this sucks, and there's nothing we can do about it. Like, we're just always gonna potentially get hacked, even our what's it called? Those like 1Password and all of those other things.
Yeah.
But now
Right.
that I see, sorry. Oh, I thought one of you guys said something. But yeah, now that I've joined TBD and I've gotten to connect with other SSI companies, I think that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But yeah, I do think it sucks. And I'm curious from y'all. I'll push this back on y'all. How come you think that like Europe and all these other countries are progressing more than US in terms of like SSI? And why does like for example, Europe is coming out with a wallet. Why do you guys think that that's progressing more than it is like over here?
I mean, it's just informed leadership, regulation. It's a completely different environment. They have the same, I mean, their problem isn't any greater than our problem. It's the same problem, but we have, the US government and what's happening in Washington, and they have, the ability to coordinate regulation and policy better. Don't you agree, Mike?
Yeah. So, and just to make a pitch for a future episode, we just got a confirmation. Annette Steenbergen from the EU. She works on the EU identity project. She'll be coming on as a guest probably sometime in July.
Great.
Why Europe? Yeah, I think Europe is as a liberal democracy or a union of liberal democracies has maybe been able to make a more rational decision. I think that the use cases around healthcare in particular are front and center for them. They tried for a number of years to do identity cards, physical cards, and failed. And so mobile seems like they've been trying to do this for years, and maybe mobile presents an answer where physical cards were not able to. So it brings up a good question because yeah, I do feel a little bit curmudgeon-y on this topic because I feel like, the value of federated today is clearly higher for a lot of businesses. But I do think that self-sovereign is the technology that we need in the future, or not self-sovereign, but let's just say wallet-based,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so the wallet is a real thing. But one of the challenges for businesses in particular and CIOs is to know, when is this technology going to be mainstream? Are we talking about 5 years, or are we talking about 15 years? Because that's really important in terms of what type of investments we should be making, and whether in fact this research should be done by startups or done by universities, because universities tend to make longer term, riskier bets on technology.
Mhm.
So maybe this topic is really too early, So what are your thoughts on the timing? You say, well, this is going to happen, but my question is when?
Okay, well, first of all, it's not a research project because it's happening every day. I appreciate that the universities are good at research. The work that Roselle and I are doing, we have thousands of people sign up every day. So it's real, it's happening here today. Now, whether we get to, 10 million or 100 million people in the US with digital identities in, 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years, it's hard for me to tell. But what I'll tell you right now is, every year we're doing 20x the number we did the year before. So as far as we're concerned, there's plenty of blue ocean out there for us today. The issue is, Mike, it's only going to accelerate as fast as we get adoption. We get enterprises to adopt it and get use cases, right? We're getting a lot of activity consumer to consumer. That's happening every day, right? But in order for this to really take off, we need to get large organizations, large institutions to buy into digital identity, like the National Notary Association, for example, like AARP will soon. We have maybe 150 use cases of enterprises using our technology today. So we need to keep expanding that and getting more, at the top of the funnel, right? Because every time, a notary onboards onto our system, for example, right? They're onboarding because they have to in order to be able to do home mortgages in America, right? But Mike, they're still going to Facebook, they're still going to Twitter and all these other places. Every day, they're still consumers using digital identity, right? So we need sort of some combination of, large enterprises continuing to push their stakeholders to use it, and a lot of consumer to consumer activity in order for us to grow. But it's definitely not a science project. It's real. It's happening every day, and there's no doubt we need more adoption use cases. And I think Roselle will tell you that right now. She needs more adoption use cases on her platform too.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I liken the issue to the problem that AI had. Like at first, AI was like this thing up in the air that it seemed like a research project and no one could really use it. And then OpenAI made it more accessible to both developers and your everyday users. So they came out with ChatGPT, where even your grandma could type in and talk to AI. And then they made some APIs that even like your everyday developer can use without having to have a PhD in like AI. So I think right now, in addition to what Jeff's saying, like some of our problem is like it sounds a little too complex to people. And so like we just need to work on like use cases and bringing it down to where people can see like the value and be able to like implement it without having like deep knowledge of like cryptography, which I think TBD is working on.
Yeah. I would just make one point, Mike. Let me just make this point really quickly. We completely abstract the tech away for the consumer, right? Like if you looked at our presentation, our investor presentation, we don't use the word blockchain once. Like the blockchain is incidental to consumers owning their own identity. It's important, right? It's an important part of the tech behind, what we do. But, Roselle and I don't go to market talking about DIDs and cryptography and wallets. In fact, you know what we've learned, Mike? Consumers don't give a shit about a wallet. The first 2.5 years we had in our navigation, we had the wallet, right? With all the credentials, right? So we, in our recent presentation of UI to consumers, we don't even use the word wallet, right? The wallet is this sort of cloud-based, asymmetrically, using asymmetric cryptography, all this stuff up there. They don't want to see it. They don't care about it. All they want to do is be able to prove things about themselves. And we use the word profile to hold the credentials, and we use the word passes now for credentials. So we're starting to use more of the vocabulary that consumers are used to.
So actually, let's go to the notary use case, because this is interesting. Was the fact that your storage of the data wasn't a big honeypot a deciding factor in the notary's decision to use your service, or were you just a cheap way to KYC these notaries? Like, was the architecture that you're promoting, was that the unique selling proposition that actually got notary to agree to use your service?
I think that is such a good question, Mike. And I'll be honest with you, it wasn't the entirety of the value prop, right? Part of the value prop was an inexpensive, highly reliable KYC tech that they could just, that they could use to absolutely verify that the notary presenting the credentials to Notary Association were valid, right? So that was a big part of it. And then and another factor was the decentralized nature of the storage, right? Because their concern always is, well, who's going to come get it, right? And the nature of decentralized storage is that it's very safe. It's safer than centralized storage, right? So it was some combination of the two, but really it was the efficiency of the KYC engine, to get this done.
Yeah. Well, we're actually right at the end. Rizal, any last thoughts?
I do not. I was gonna just say thank you for having me. But I thought this was a really good conversation. No other thoughts around identity from me.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating. Jeff, last thoughts?
What I would say is, I think you scratched the, you scratched down a couple layers, Mike, and I appreciate that. The value of this identity information is going to become more apparent over time as consumers start to realize that their information is worth something more than a slice of pizza. And as that realization takes place, Mike, then they're going to want a safe, secure way to use and reuse their identity. It's going to involve reusable identity for the enterprise. It's just a matter of time. But our view is it has to come from the consumer. It has to be end to end. It can't be one enterprise verifying everybody, because it's just not going to work anymore.
Okay, well, so next week we actually will have some blockchain talk. We're going to talk with Steve Wilson from Australia, from Constellation Research, about NFTs and what he thinks is interesting about them. And Otto Mora from Polygon will be joining us. Otto works for Polygon Identity. So we're actually continuing blockchain decentralized chat a little bit. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
Rizal, thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Rizal, thanks for participating.
Of course, this was fun.
And yeah, and keep tuning in if you're from the audience. And